Hey everybody, welcome back to another episode of The Local Youth Worker, a podcast brought to you by Reformed Youth Ministries. I'm your host, John Parrott. Today's interview is going to be a little different. Some of you may be familiar with Youth Pastor Theologian, which is a ministry that Mike McGarry has started, and you'll hear more about that in just a little bit. We decided to do a crossover interview, and so Mike and I met, and I interviewed him about Youth Pastor Theologian, as well as some of his books that I would highly recommend, and they will be in the show notes of this podcast. But then he interviews me about RYM, about the Local Youth Worker Podcast, and some other resources. So what you're about to hear is, I think it's first my interview with Mike, and then we'll have a break, and then he'll interview me. And so as this begins, he'll be introducing himself, and then I'll introduce myself. So I hope you enjoy this.
1, 2, 1, 2, 3. I'm Mike McGarry, and I am the founder and director of Youth Pastor Theologian. I'm married to my wife, Tracy, who's a public educator. We're at 19 years, going strong, and next year's 20th anniversary. So we got to plan something good. John, I saw you guys just cross the 20-year mark, so maybe we can talk about some anniversary ideas offline.
Absolutely.
I got two teenage age kids at home. Was a youth pastor for 18 years before recently starting to lead Youth Pastor Theologian full time, and I've written a few books that I think we're going to talk about in a little bit. So it's a little bit about me.
And I'm John Parrott. I am the Director of Resources for Reformed Youth Ministries. I've been on staff with them about 7 years, and prior to that, was a youth director, a youth intern, director of junior high ministries, so some youth ministry capacity for about 20 years, a little over. I'm married to Ashley, as Mike said. We've been married or just hit 20 years this past June. Had a great time in Jamaica. Yeah, Mike, love to tell you about
Jamaica.
that.
All right. Now we're talking.
Yeah. And we have 5 children. 2 of them are teenagers, and then 11-year-old, 9-year-old, 7-year-old. And I get their names right most of the time, but I can also mess that up a little bit. Yeah, and also I've written a little bit, and I'm sure we'll talk about some of those details a little bit more later. And Mike and I were talking a little pre-recording. We know we're going to have some kind of intro that will be on our own individual podcast channels. And so I think we've said, yeah, Mike's going to be kind of the focus of, and Mike and his ministry, the focus of this first part of the interview, and then we'll get into some other things with RYM. Mike, for our listeners, why don't you tell us, I guess let's start with Youth Pastor Theologian, and then we'll go back and talk about some of your books as well. When did this idea come along? When did you kind of formally start this, and just, a little bit more about the ministry?
Yeah. Well, I started the website, youthpastortheologian.com, in May of 2020. So, no, 2021. So it's a little over 2 years old. And I have been writing about and blogging about youth ministry and gospel-centered youth ministry and theology and youth ministry for quite some time, and was chewing over different ideas for a new website and a new blog. And I didn't want it to be MikeMcGarry.com. I really wanted to try to help youth workers to really embrace the role of theology and theological depth and student ministry. And then I randomly thought back to my Twitter profile, actually. And so when I first joined Twitter, I wrote a bio for myself. And I don't know how long ago that was, but I put Youth Pastor Theologian in my Twitter bio like 10 or 12 years ago. And so I thought about my Twitter bio, and I was like, Youth Pastor Theologian. Yeah, that'll work. And so it's kind of just stuck, and it's kind of a bit of a unique name, but it's very descriptive of what it is we're about. So
Mm-hmm.
Youth Pastor Theologian, or YPT, is a ministry that's committed to helping youth workers to practice theology in ministry. We're not trying to make teenagers little theological scholars or anything. We're trying to help them be Christians, right? And so that involves doctrine. And what does it mean to be a Christian? What does it mean to think Christianly? Right? What makes our faith unique, different from the faith of their peers at school and in their communities? And so, yeah, we just want to help serve and train youth workers to think biblically, first and foremost, about what youth ministry is. I think that's a question we don't really talk about nearly often enough. We want to jump straight to how do I do it better without really ever asking, but what are we doing? Like, biblically speaking, what is youth ministry? So we want to help youth workers have conversations about that question. And then the second emphasis has to do with training youth workers to teach theologically with confidence, recognizing there's a bit of a distinction between teaching theology and teaching theologically. There's obviously a significant overlap, but we want to always be teaching theologically so that we're raising up students into a biblical worldview, so that they are thinking and living from a biblical viewpoint and worldview. So Youth Pastor Theologian has a blog. We have a website, a very small YouTube channel. Not sure if anything's ever going to happen with that. And we have a pretty active Facebook group too, that somehow has kind of blown up in the last few months. But
Nice.
yeah, so it's a little bit about YPT.
Yeah, and for those who are listening, I'll put links in the show notes to Youth Pastor Theologian. And so you talked about you've got a blog, a little bit of a YouTube channel, and a podcast. Do you want to talk a little bit more about your podcast, just kind of the frequency of it, how often episodes drop and all that kind of stuff?
Yeah, happy to do that. So the Youth Pastor Theologian podcast comes out on Tuesdays over most weeks throughout the school year. So we take a little bit of a break during the summer, and then a little bit of break around major holidays. But for the most part, the Youth Pastor Theologian podcast features a conversation like what we're having today between myself and a guest about some area of theology and ministry, theological depth. So we've talked recently with Sean McGarry about theology of evangelism and conversion, right? How does our doctrine of conversion affect the way we share the gospel? And he's a real sharp thinker, right? So we want to have it's not just practical how-to tips, right? But really digging into how does doctrine drive practice? Other conversations about essentials of a biblical worldview and ministry to students with special needs, and how do we think biblically and theologically about students with disability, and how do we minister to parents who recently get that diagnosis for their child, and right, so just a blend of real practical stuff that we're bringing theological depth to, and then other topics that are more explicitly doctrinal that we're bringing a student ministry perspective to. So that's kind of the interchange with
Yeah.
what we try to focus on in our podcast.
Yeah, that's great. And I want to say too, kind of backing up a little bit, I think the first time I heard about you or just got to know you was through Walt Mueller.
Yeah, same.
And yeah, and so you went, or I guess your D-Min, you studied under him. Is that right? Is
I
that how
did.
you guys first met?
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah. So I
And,
did the D-Min program at Gordon Conwell.
okay. And then shortly after there, it seems that your first book I read, was it a biblical theology of youth ministry? Is that the title?
Yep.
Okay. And I want to point people to that book. That was a very helpful book. And for those youth workers out there, and you're kind of saying those who are just kind of doing youth ministry, but not really giving a whole lot of thought to kind of theological foundation for it. That's a great book. But then also your second book, I believe, Lead Them to Jesus.
Mhm.
Those who listen to the local youth worker podcast, RYM's podcast, Mike came on a long time ago. I cannot remember when, to talk about that book. And that book, I want to continue to point people to that book. I know people use that and have heard of that book. For those of you who have not heard of that book, I would say if you're in youth ministry, it's a must own. It is. It's a book you can obviously read cover to cover, but it's kind of a reference book. I mean, you can just pick up and jump into different chapters because you've got two sections. You've got kind of basic biblical truths, I think, is the first section, and then kind of practical things. Again, where theology is informing kind of some of the more practical elements of youth ministry. But maybe just talk a little bit about Lead Them to Jesus as well.
Yeah. So the idea for that books came out from when I was starting at a new church, and was thinking through, how do I get my team of volunteers on the same page? And what I'd found the hard way previously in ministry is that you can use the same vocabulary together and sound like you're agreeing, but you're using a very different dictionary. So you're saying the same thing, you're agreeing with each other, but what you mean is something completely different. And so a lot of that happens when we talk about gospel-centered youth ministry and Bible-based youth ministry. And of course, everyone agrees to that. But what do we mean by it? So I
Yeah.
thought through, okay, so I want to talk through these topics with my youth leaders. And I wrote out a whole list of topics. And next thing I knew, I had way too many topics to realistically go through with them. And so, I like writing, so maybe I'll just write a few just short articles for them, and then kind of realize, well, I think this is the table of contents for a book. This, if I'm writing these out for my youth workers anyways, I might as well see if a publisher might want to make this beneficial for more than just me and my youth leaders. And so Lead Them to Jesus really came out from my own need for a resource like that in my ministry. So the first half of the book focuses on biblical and theological truths that just volunteer youth workers who haven't been to Bible college or seminary, and they don't really consider themselves theologians, but students are asking real questions. And so do the volunteers in our ministry have the confidence to actually engage into those conversations, or do they kind of just like pass those off and say, oh, go talk to Pastor Mike, go talk to John, do they just shrug those questions off? And then the other half of the book is focused on just really the nuts and bolts, the practical elements of how the gospel shapes everything in our ministry, from the way we recruit new volunteers and train them, to the way we play games and plan events and retreats, the way we handle discipline, the way we engage with short-term, long-term missions trips, the way we partner with parents, the way obviously we are teaching. So just the whole sweep of things we do in ministry. Each chapter in that second half really wants to be deliberate about applying the gospel at the heart of every element of our student ministry, not just our evangelism.
Yeah, no, it is so good, and it covers so much. And again, just want to encourage people to pick that up. And I'm glad, as you were even talking, it's an excellent resource to give volunteers, as you were saying, those volunteers who are passionate about youth ministry, helping, but haven't been able to go to seminary or Bible college. It covers a lot where, again, these are short chapters. So, busy volunteers who are doing something else, they could pick this up and, read a chapter. Some of them are 2 to 3 pages. Some might be a little shorter. Some might be a little bit longer, but such a
Each
great
chapter
resource.
is basically a blog post. So, because I was like, my volunteers, I've tried getting my volunteers to read books before, and it's always been a struggle. But great volunteers, committed volunteers. So I'm not
Sure.
criticizing. It's just hard, right? Let's face it.
Sure. Yeah.
So short chapters, easy to read, easy to skim, easy to discuss together when you meet with your team to choose, one or two chapters to read
Hmm.
ahead of time and to discuss as you meet with your volunteer team.
Yeah. And so at RYM's Youth Leader Training, as well as our summer conferences, we have a book table, and that book has been featured on that book table at each of those events and will continue to be on there because it's just such a helpful resource. And this summer, we had your newest book on our book table, Discover Questioning Your Way to Faith. Is that it? Did I get the
That's
subtitle
it.
right?
Got
Yeah.
it.
And it's got a cool cover. It's got a big question mark on it, and it's like a cutout on the cover, so you can kind of flip it open, and there's a bunch of question marks inside. Anyway, I think it's a cool design.
Mm-hmm.
I have not been able to read it, as I was telling you before recording. I think some of it, I think it's sold out on our book table, so I didn't get one. But um, tell us a little bit about this book, kind of the
Yeah.
origins of it. How did this come about? And then we'll dig in a little bit.
Yeah. So interesting is that when I got my copies of Lead Them to Jesus was actually during a student service week at church. So the church was full of students from my youth group doing service projects, and then my author copies of the book came in. So we kind of like circled people up, and my youth leaders made a big deal out of it and everything. And so we got the book out and passed it around, and some of the students were opening up and reading the table of contents of Lead Them to Jesus. And that first section of answering students' theological questions, some of the students were like, oh, like if this was written for teenagers, I would
Hmm.
totally read this.
Hmm.
Because, yeah, these are questions that I have asked and that I'm curious about. So I was like, oh, well, okay. So I talked with the publisher at New Growth Press and said, hey, this is what some of the students said. What do you think about, kind of revisiting some of these chapters, maybe adding a few others, and, repurposing some of this and rewriting some of it so that we're providing some good theological content for students. And so that's really what happened. So some of the chapters were just edited. A lot of them were pretty heavily kind of reworked. Some of them were completely rewritten because I'd say it very differently to teenagers
Sure.
than I would to adults who are going to talk to teenagers. And some of the chapters are just completely new. But that's really the origin, was from students literally saying, I would read this if it was written for teenagers.
Yeah.
And as I've given the book away, that still is a lot of the feedback I'm getting from students is, these are all questions that we're asking. And I don't think that many teenagers come up and say, John, tell me more about the Trinity. Right. So some of them aren't explicitly questions that they're going to outright ask the way that they show up in the table of contents. But then the students get the book and they look at that and they go, yeah, I really am very confused about like, what is the deal with the
Hmm.
Trinity? Right. So it's not always questions that they're going to ask off the top of their head as a felt need. But they are questions that teenagers are asking, that they are curious about. And so there's some more doctrinal questions like the Trinity, and there's other definitely felt need topics like mental health, anxiety, depression,
Hmm.
and sexual and gender identities and things like that too.
Yeah. No, I like that because, yeah, like you said, there's going to be just those common questions that students are asking. But then those like the Trinity and other kind of doctrinal questions, they're not necessarily going to ask, but vitally important for their faith. And so maybe talk a little bit about that of not only the deeper theological kind of doctrine type questions, but also the others as well. Um, was it challenging, writing these in a way that's accessible for teenagers? And I guess, yes, it was, but how did you go about trying to communicate
Yeah.
that to teenagers?
Yeah. Well, I mean, as a veteran youth pastor, a lot of these are topics that I've talked about with teenagers for
Hmm.
a long time. So thankfully I wasn't starting from zero, you know, but it is difficult. Like, it's one of the most challenging chapters, frankly, was the chapter about end times, right? Will Jesus
Hmm.
really return?
Hmm.
Um, because I wanted to be very fair about the different um, eschatological viewpoints. And so how do you summarize all the different eschatological perspectives, um, summarizing each one in one paragraph in a way that someone who believes that viewpoint would read it and say, yes, that's accurate. That
Hmm.
is what I believe. And then to pull together the common threads of what do we all agree on, and then to apply, like, why does this matter? Like,
Hmm.
just pastorally, like, as a Christian, here's why this is so important for us to believe that Jesus really will return. Whatever viewpoint you fall on, here's why this matters, right? So it some of the chapters took a lot of time, for 4 or 5 page chapters.
Hmm.
It's a little bit like Mark Twain saying, I didn't have time to write you a short letter, so I wrote you a long one instead. Sometimes short writing
Oh yeah,
is really difficult and time consuming, but
for sure.
I trust it'll serve our students well.
Yeah, I've loved that Mark Twain quote, and I've used that a little bit. That, yeah, I mean, oftentimes we as youth workers, it is more challenging to try to communicate something that's
Mm-hmm.
headier to, younger students. So yeah, I know that that comes through in the writing. What were some of those other questions that you do cover in the book? I mean, those you're talking about mental health, anxiety, depression, and I know we were kind of joking pre-recording that sometimes you write these books and then they come out and it's been a while since you've kind of been in it, and so you might even struggle to look through. I mean, I see you, and I can tell kind of behind the scenes. He's having to grab a copy of his book, so
I
I
was
was trying
like,
to
oh
buy him some
gosh, I
time.
don't remember, John. What
I
are
was
these
just curious
chapters?
some of the ones that you try to cover.
Oh, some of the ones I really enjoyed writing, um, were "Is it okay to doubt?"
Hmm.
Um, uh, it feels weird to
Hmm.
say, but I'm a big fan of doubt.
Oh yeah.
I'm just always been a very naturally curious question
Hmm.
asking person,
Hmm.
and so yeah, I think a lot of our students who are the same way and ask a lot of questions often feel like, stop asking so many questions, right? Stop being so difficult. So like, is it okay to doubt? Like, what's a healthy kind of doubt, and what's an unhealthy kind of doubt? Instead of just labeling all doubt as bad,
Hmm.
just have more faith, right? So that was a fun one. I think another important one, is about how can a loving God send anyone to hell?
Hmm.
One of my
Wow.
concerns, theologically, in student ministry is, I think a lot of the more grace filled, gospel centered tribe, not just youth ministry, but just in general. I think sometimes we don't want to be those type of Christians, and I don't want to be like hellfire and brimstone. So we just never talk about judgment. We never talk about the wrath of God. We never really
Hmm.
talk about the law, and our sinfulness. And I think that there's a fair bit of Christian universalism growing up under our noses um, that we just need to be aware of. And so, yeah, I
Hmm.
think this chapter on how can a loving God send anyone to hell, hopefully is very instructive and helpful for our students, because I think that's a question that every church kid wrestles with and asks.
Yeah,
So,
absolutely. I mean, that's I'm so glad you're including that in there because yeah, I agree with what you're saying. That yes, we need to emphasize grace. We need to talk about grace and get our students to grasp it. But an aspect of that is, a full picture of the gospel
yeah,
does involve punishment, does involve yeah, an eternity that's awaiting all of us, and so we can shy away from that kind of discussion at times. So I'm glad you're including that in there.
yeah. So, and yeah, I hope the chapter on prayer is helpful too, right? Why pray if God will do what he wants?
Hmm.
because that's a question that I struggled with personally for quite a while. And so, yeah, just kind of really saying, why pray if God will do what he wants? Why pray if God isn't sovereign?
Mm.
Right? Like, what's the point of prayer if God can't answer it? Why pray for someone's salvation if he's like, oh yeah, I really want them to believe too. Right. So, yeah, just
That's
trying to
good.
help give confidence to say, look, we pray because God is sovereign,
Yeah.
and because the Lord has commanded us to. He has told us to, but we don't use God's sovereignty as an excuse not to pray. Yeah, he's just going to do it anyway. We pray with faith because he's sovereign. So, yeah,
Yeah.
those are a few of the chapters that I really
Yeah.
enjoyed putting together.
No, that's good. And yeah, I look forward to digging more into that one. And just to remind our listeners, check out the show notes. I'll have all of these books linked, as well as Youth Pastor Theologian's website. We'll have that up there. And I think now we're going to maybe turn the tables, and Mike's going to interview me a little bit. And so if you're listening to this on our podcast channel, we'll have just a brief break, and then we'll be back with more.
I will welcome back, and I'm glad to be talking with John Parrott. And John, I got a few questions for you. So for the Youth Pastor Theologian community, it's kind of funny how these things work out. So it's funny. You look at the different, very similar type of ministry philosophy, like biblically deep, rich student ministry organizations, and Reformed Youth Ministries is very Presbyterian. Rooted Ministry is very Anglican, and YPT is very Baptist. And so it's funny how we can kind of fall into these little cloisters and such. But I really love Reformed Youth Ministry. When I came to your youth leader training a couple years ago, we had a good laugh that I was the only Baptist there. But I was never made to feel like I didn't belong. It was just kind of a funny little joke together.
Yeah.
So for YPT listeners who may be unfamiliar with Reformed Youth Ministry, could you just share a little bit about what is RYM and what's your ministry philosophy that you advocate for?
Yeah, sure. No, thanks. And yeah, it was great having you there. And it's interesting too. Yes, definitely. There's a lot of Presbyterian influence in churches and all that are involved, but RYM's not directly tied to any denomination. And so, kind of backing up, just giving some of the history. So, we recently celebrated 50 years of ministry. So 1972, there were 3 youth workers who were kind of tired of the fun and games youth ministry, and they wanted to start a conference that was centered on the preaching and teaching of the word. And so they launched the first conference again back in 1972, and that's kind of all RYM was for decades. Was just one summer youth conference, and I think maybe there was a second. I know we've been looking at some of the history recently, and R.C. Sproul was an early speaker at one of these conferences, which is
awesome.
fun to think about him being there. But so we've expanded to, and really our 3 avenues of ministry are conferences, training, resources. And so RYM currently has 6 summer youth conferences. There's one in Colorado, 3 in Florida, 1 in Maryland, and then 1 in Texas.
And these are for student ministers to bring their teenagers to.
That's exactly right. Yeah. And so there's, let's see, I think it's 4 senior high conferences and then 2 middle school conferences. Yeah. And really, and so it's about, I don't know, 5,000 students that come in a summer close to there. And yeah, we have Presbyterians, Baptists, non-denominational, a mix for sure that come to these in the summers. And, the hope is to expand that as well. I mean, we're praying, thinking about getting more on the West Coast as well. But yeah, you can go and check out all of our conferences on our website, rym.org. You'll see the 3 avenues, and something we've said about youth ministry for a while is that youth ministry isn't just ministry to youth, it's ministry to families. And so that's really where some of the youth leader training came about. And I don't know if it was maybe 2008 when they intentionally kind of launched a youth leader training. We have two of these. One is in Nashville, Tennessee. It takes place the last week in January, the last full week in January every year. And then we've partnered with CPYU, that's Center for Parent Youth Understanding. I'm sure those who listen to YPT have heard of Walt Mueller and CPYU plenty of times. And of course, we mentioned Walt just a little earlier. But that's near Pittsburgh area, and it's early March. I don't have the exact dates. But those training events, we're trying to really talk about a lot of what you were talking about earlier, Mike, is to give people a philosophy of ministry. And then something we say oftentimes is that we have a fixed theology and a flexible methodology, that we have a theology that does not change, and we're going to work out of that. And the way in which that theology could be applied in your context, wherever it is, might look different in terms of methodology, but there are things, about our theology that are not going to change, that we're going to cling to. And so it's an encouraging time. And yeah, Mike, it was encouraging to have you there. And that was the year right after COVID, where it was kind of, a hybrid youth leader training. It was just a little bit different from some of our others. And so we kind of combined both training events into one. And so it was just a little different. But then we also at RYM, we have resources. That's our third avenue of ministry. And that's where I serve as the director of resources. Mike, you were talking about eschatology a minute ago. We have, I think off the top of my head, 12 free Bible studies that are available right now. And one of those is Eschatology 101. And, we thought even the title of that, are students going to be interested, but they are very interested in end times. And, we think of just so much in popular culture, from zombie movies to all kind of post-apocalyptic type things. I mean, there's an obsession with the end times. And, and so, if anyone goes to our website, they can download those free Bible studies. We try to release about 2 of those every year. We just want to serve the local church and give away good resources for free. So please be sure to check those out. We also have a podcast entitled The Local Youth Worker. And that's a weekly podcast that comes out. We have authors on there, professors, counselors, youth workers. The title is emphasizing just the local youth worker in every congregation and trying to serve them. And we know that some youth workers are serving in very lonely contexts where they don't get a lot of interaction. And so we hope that it just kind of fosters somewhat of a community for those who are kind of working alone, because we know that youth ministry can be a very lonely place. And so it's, when we started that podcast, we were focused specifically on the youth worker and serving them. But it's been interesting to hear how many parents tune in to the podcast and listen to the podcast. And so that's definitely grown over time. And so that's a little bit of what we do. I know you were also going to ask about the track series. And that's something that I can point people to as well.
Could you share what are some of the different titles in the track series? And what's that all about?
Yeah. And so kind of backing up, given just a little bit of some backstory there. So when I was the youth director at a church in the Jackson, Mississippi area, we would do an orientation every year of kind of first-time parents coming into the ministry and trying to just give them a big picture of the ministry, and also encourage them in that orientation that they are the primary disciplers of their children, and that we're not trying to take their job away from them, and to encourage them in that. And Timothy Paul Jones is a name that many are familiar with. So I went to Southern Baptist Theological Seminary in Louisville, Kentucky, and Timothy Paul Jones is one of my professors, and he's written on family ministry and a lot of other things. But he says that oftentimes parents hear from the church that they are the primary disciplers of their children, but that they feel that the church fails in giving them resources to properly disciple their children. And so just one of the things I would try to do for parents coming into the ministry was just give them a document that had some suggested books to
Mhm.
be reading alongside their children. And I kind of
Awesome.
had that broken up into grades. Kind of here's some more junior high level, here's maybe ninth and 10th, and here's some for 11th and 12th, and just
Yeah.
kind of try to lay out some of that. Fast forwarding to my time with RYM, we created a student discipleship guide with Josh Byers, who some people may be familiar with. He does visual theology with Tim Challies, and that's a free PDF that begins in the 6th grade and goes all the way through 12th and breaks it down to fall, winter, spring, summer, just books to be reading or to be putting into the hands of your children. And so that's a guide that kind of came from that. And really, the track series, I know this is kind of a long backstory, kind of came out of this concept. And a lot of what we say is that one of the primary ways we can be discipling the next generation is to disciple them to be readers, that
Yeah.
God chose a book to reveal himself,
Mhm.
that we cannot overstate the significance of words in Christianity. And so we wanted to create some booklets that are accessible, but written specifically for students. And so they're accessible just by the size. If you saw one of these booklets in the track series, they're about the size of an iPhone, maybe, a little bit bigger.
Mhm.
Um, but there are currently 15 titles in the track series, and the three big categories are doctrine, Christian life, and then culture. And some of the doctrine titles that we have, and I guess I should say all of the titles of these are a student's guide to blank. And so we have a student's guide to sanctification, student's guide to glorification, justification, missions. We also have a student's guide to anxiety, depression, gaming, a student's guide to womanhood, let's see, dating, marriage, and sex. There's more out there that I'm forgetting, but I know we've got some coming out soon. One on rest, one on body image, and so our hope is about every 6 months or so to be releasing 3 new titles. We partnered with Christian Focus Publication to release these. They're about $3.99, I think, on Amazon.
Yeah.
Some of them are
Yeah.
$4.99. So, and you can buy them in bulk too and get those cheaper. But really, these are designed for youth workers to put in the hands of students, that they're written for students, even though some of these are written by Ligon Duncan and Derek Thomas and
That's what I was just
others.
going to highlight. I mean, some of the
Yeah,
names, I don't know how you got some of these authors
I
to
don't
write
either.
in this series,
Yeah,
but I mean, yeah,
yeah.
very impressed.
Well, we were excited that so I know like Steve Nichols did one on apologetics.
Hmm.
And I mean, I serve as the series editor for these books, and I joke and I say I take people's work and I dumb it down so that others can understand it. But I was just so impressed. I mean, Steve Nichols, just highlighting him, brilliant theologian. But he communicated in such an accessible way where I felt like his work was just kind of untouched on modifying it. And sometimes it's just changing the verbiage and the examples to
Yeah.
resonate more with students. But yeah, it's been encouraging. And again, looking at these books, we have Baptists that have written these, Presbyterians, just others, and so really trying to, and that's something just as RYM kind of as a whole, although we kind of were birthed out of the Presbyterian Church, trying to be broad in just our reach and to not be tied specifically to a denomination. And so, what we've tried to show that in various ways, but in this specific way with our track series to get a lot of different authors involved from various backgrounds. But yeah, it's our hope that youth workers can take these little booklets and can hand them out and use those in small groups, even maybe modify some of these to large groups. But I feel like I've been talking a lot, and I need to stop and let you you jump in. But that's a little bit about the
No,
track series.
I love the track series. They're short, accessible. Yeah, if you want to have, I was even thinking, I mean, some of these could be really good for like a baptism class or
Mm,
just a short, deep dive. So like I know a lot of youth pastors I've been hearing from, and getting pictures, which has really been fun, of
Hmm.
them using the Discover book with their
Yeah.
students. But there's 20 chapters in Discover. I mean, so that's a good portion of your school year if
Yeah.
you're going to do one a week. The track series is really, really great, and could even just be like, you know what, we're going to have a 3-week Bible study, or we're going to have a 4-week study on glorification, or on, end times, or like
Hmm.
choose one of the books and just have a short term Bible study. Um, Maybe it's between sports seasons when students might be more available, or during, Christmas vacation, or there's lots of different ways that you can have like a short term Bible study that's like a deep dive for kids who are ready for that.
Hmm.
And I think the track series is a really outstanding resource for it. So,
No,
um,
I appreciate that encouragement. As you're saying that, I'm thinking too, every chapter has discussion questions at the end. So,
mhm.
to kind of have that
Yeah,
time, if it's small group, just to have some questions at the end can be helpful too.
yep, yep. All right. So you recently came out with a devotional for students about social media pressure. Um, Could you tell us a little bit about what prompted
Mm-hmm.
you to write a book about social media? How in the world can social media, I'm saying this emphatically, right? How can social media negatively impact a student's life? I've never imagined that could happen,
I know.
right?
It's
Like,
it's all
tell us a little
good.
bit about this
Yeah.
devotional.
Yeah, no, yeah. So this past summer, New Growth Press released "Social Media Pressure," the subtitle "Finding Peace Alongside Jesus," and it's a devotional book. They had released another book in this series, and I think it's "Alongside Jesus" is the
Hmm.
title.
Yeah,
Some people may
yeah,
know Drew Hill, who wrote "Alongside." They kind of from that developed a devotional alongside Jesus, and so this book, "Social Media Pressure," is the second in that series, and it's some devotionals that will hopefully again written for teenagers that hopefully will just help them be more thoughtful in their engagement with social media. We know social media is here to stay. Yes, there's legislation and other kind of conversations taking place where stricter restrictions and boundaries might be put in place to kind of make it less accessible to teenagers. But until then, I mean, we as youth workers, as parents, need to be discipling our students on how to utilize social media in a way that can be God honoring. And yeah, it was challenging, writing a devotional to just yeah try to guide students in this. But yeah, it's my hope that at least some of it's going to introduce them to a biblical worldview and just more thoughtful engagement of how they pick up their devices and interact with various social media platforms.
yeah. All right. So let us hear a little bit more about that. So, how does a gospel shaped worldview inform the way we engage with social media, and
Hmm.
from a teenager's perspective?
Sure, yeah. So much with social media, we talk about anxiety and we talk about depression and kind of
Yeah.
those on the rise because of these devices. And so, really, with this devotional, there's kind of a thread of fear that runs through each chapter, because that's such a common emotion and aspect, from fear of missing out and all
Hmm.
sorts of other things. And so, I thought it would be appropriate to begin the book, and I should say the structure of the book. It's a 4-week devotional, and there's 4 entries every week, and so there's some grace days that are woven throughout each week. So if students are busy, they get behind.
Yeah.
It's okay if they miss some days. But the first section, so that first week, is trying to establish the fear of the Lord. And so the hope is, I mean, with any topic, we begin with God, right? And so
Hmm.
thinking with social media, okay, instead of just diving into various platforms and issues, we've got to start with God. And so
Hmm.
trying to get
Yeah.
students to see how a fear of the Lord will shape how they pick up their device,
Yep.
what they say, on various platforms, and even sharing a story from my childhood of how I was talking bad about one of my friends, and I was just kind of speaking openly in the classroom, not kind at all. And his mom walked into the room right as I was saying that. And I knew I was speaking loud enough to where she heard that, outside the classroom. And I was just absolutely mortified. And
Yeah.
so, kind of taking that illustration for students to see, okay, our God is looking at everything we say
Yeah.
on social media, everything we like, we choose not to like, to withhold likes. He's looking at all of that. And so how can just a fear of God shape how we interact on social media? And so that's kind of the first introductory one
Hmm.
is the fear of the Lord, and kind of growing that through the first week. But that's a little bit just kind of the theology driving our worldview there.
Yeah. That's good. All right. So for youth workers, I mean, I think part of the reality is to do student ministry today is to be engaged in social media. I mean, I have a hard time picturing youth ministry without leveraging social media to some point or degree, right?
Mm-hmm.
So, what are some general guidelines that you recommend for youth workers to evaluate their own use of social media? And what are some boundaries you would encourage youth workers to have to model a healthy engagement with social media for their students?
Yeah, no, that's a great question. And really, I think you're kind of giving the answer right there. It's realizing that we are modeling something, that, we can talk about the various stats. I know some say it's in the ballpark of 7 to 9 hours of screen time a day for teenagers, and we can say all those things and we can lament that. But what I often say is that we need to realize we're worse than teenagers. That so often we can lament how much they're on it, but in a lot of circumstances, teenagers have more boundaries on them than we do with us,
Yeah.
and we all know these devices are designed to be addictive. And some of the most brilliant minds in the world, engineers, are behind these platforms to keep us on them more constantly. And so, for us to recognize that, and recognize, I guess, if we want to put it this way, the plank in our own eye before we see the speck in our students' eyes. Excuse me. And so I think that's a good place to start, is kind of humbly realizing we're fellow strugglers. And I think talking about that with our students, saying that as youth workers, of, hey, listen, I'm challenging you guys on this specific aspect of social media, but you need to realize that, like, I'm struggling too, that this is not something I'm immune to. And so kind of beginning with humility, I think, is the first thing, and to speak more openly about our own struggles. As we're talking about modeling, being aware that our students are watching us, that if you're interacting with students and you typically have a phone in your hand, and you're, or have a smartwatch, and as they're talking to you, you're constantly checking your
Yeah.
watch and looking at, we just have to be aware of those things, because in many ways we are giving license to our students to interact with technology in that same way.
Hmm.
And so we have to be cautious of really, just the way that we're modeling, and to take up practices, and even for us to be vocal in some of those practices of, hey, students, here's some things I try to do to have a healthier engagement with social media, and just something I would encourage you to do. Um, but yeah, I mean, at the same time, recognize, okay, that's where our students are, and we can utilize these platforms to try to reach them and to interact with them. And at the same time, I do want to push back on that a little bit, because I do hear a lot of people say, that's where our students are, so I've got to be there. And we need to be aware that we can communicate a lot by our absence, and
Yeah.
not our presence. And so, I think it's important for youth workers to hear it could be an option not be on social media and to not be interacting all the time. Um, and so not to diminish that of just our absence there and feeling like we always have to be on and always have to respond and always have to interact. And yeah, because I do think there can be a lot of pressure on youth workers to feel like they've always got to be on it and always
Mhm.
interacting and always posting something. And so just to have some balance there. I know I kind of rambled a little bit. I don't know if I got at your specific question, but hopefully
No,
some
that's
of
really
that.
good. No, that's really helpful, and I appreciate your gentle and humble pushback on, um, yeah, the necessity of youth workers to be on social media. Um, but yeah, I think that's a good word of what do we communicate by our absence and by our physical presence instead.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, no, that's
Well,
good.
and I always want to say, and I feel like we've always, have to preface with the good of technology.
Yeah,
As we talk about social media, I mean, there are just horrific evils that we are aware of, and in some ways we can downplay the serious concern of some of these devices and technologies. But at the same time, as believers, we have to be pro technology. As we look at the creation mandate, Genesis 1:26 through 28, that's encouraging us to be pro technology, that we should be advancing technologically speaking. And so as Christians, what we need to be excited about technology and think of the ways in which we can minister through smartphones and social media. But we also have to be incredibly cautious, just as with any good gift, we must steward it wisely. And so
yeah.
to steward these devices well. So yeah, I always just want to say that in the midst of this conversation.
All right, that's a good word. All right, here's my last question. This is a throwback for
Uh,
you. So this is a long time ago. I've always wanted to talk with you on a podcast about Timeout, the gift or God of youth sports.
wow.
Do you even remember writing that book? That was probably so long ago.
Vaguely.
Um,
Yeah.
so my first introduction to you was when you were on Walt's podcast to talk
Hmm.
about this book, and I was like, "Oh man, this guy's amazing, and I love him." So could you just tell us a little bit, tell youth workers about this book? So it was published in 2018 with Christian focus. Time Out: The Gift or God of Youth Sports. Can you
Hmm.
just share a little about that book and yeah, how can youth workers navigate the love-hate relationship we all have with youth sports?
Yeah. No, you're right. That was a long time ago. And so really, I would say most youth workers that are out there listening to this can lament youth sports and just kind of shake our head when we think about how involved our students can be. I mean, I had students who would tell me when football season came along, hey, it was August, and they'll say, hey, I'll see you in December. And it's like, oh, wow. Okay.
And
You're
they weren't
saying good.
kidding. Yeah.
Yes, no, absolutely. Because they just knew the level of involvement from weightlifting to practices, they were just going to be absent from the student ministry. And so I would say many out there are familiar with that. And so, serving in student ministry for a time, there were always frustrations about youth sports. And I guess I should even back up and say, my wife was a college athlete. I played soccer in junior college. That's nothing to brag about. I'm just saying I like sports, and our family
Yeah,
likes
you're not
sports. And
anti-sports.
yes, we're not anti-sports. And so at the same time, when I got in student ministry, I just saw how idolatrous it was, because I was on the other side of sports now, and it
Yeah.
was I was blinded to kind of a lot of that, just being involved in it, and I'm just seeing kind of the negative impact of students and families just being divided. And so when I went to Southern Seminary. And I worked on a D-Min at Southern Seminary, and part of that D-Min program, you're developing a thesis. And I thought, you know what, I've spent so much of the ministry lamenting youth sports and haven't had a lot of time to really dig into this subject. And so I thought I would use this topic to just kind of dig into more and to read more and to think more about and interact with others. And so that's really where Timeout came from, was from my work at Southern Seminary. And really the book just takes a stewardship approach to sports, and wants to highlight the good of sports and praise sports and how the Lord can use sports, but also recognize the idolatrous nature of it, and the difficulties of it, and the challenges. And so, yeah, there's, I knew it wouldn't be the most popular book to write, and it would probably be stepping on some toes.
Yeah.
But I do hope those who are thoughtfully engaging the topic will see, okay, yes, it's pro sports, but at the same time, there's a lot that we as Christians are blind to, and we're not stewarding this like we can or should. And there's a lot in the book that doesn't give definitive answers. It just raises questions,
Right.
because it's hard to prescribe certain things, that the
Yeah.
scriptures don't specifically speak to. And so, it gets into Sabbath rest. It gets into just discipling our own children, making time for that, saying no, all kinds of things like that. So, I hope it's something youth workers can use. I hope it's something youth workers can borrow to kind of put in the hands of parents. That sometimes youth workers, you're in the awkward place of not being able to challenge parents in a way that's easy for you. And so when you can say, "Hey, here's something somebody else said," be mad at him. Hopefully that can help you all. But yeah, it's written for anyone passionate about discipling students and sports as well. So coaches, teachers, parents, youth workers. So I hope it's helpful.
Yeah. Yeah. It is. It is.
Well, look,
You didn't see that one coming, did you?
no, I did not. I did not. Glad I had some kind of memory of writing that, and but glad to talk about it. Glad it was a help to you, and I'd totally forgotten about that podcast with Walt talking about that.
That's good. It's good stuff.
Yeah. Well, Mike, look, this has been fun. It's been fun getting to catch up, and as we said, we don't know exactly how this will air on our own individual podcast channels, but yeah, it's fun to kind of get to play interviewer, but then also be interviewed on our own podcast, because I know we're often in the interview chair. But thanks for all you're doing. Thanks for your friendship. It was great to see you in person last week at the Gospel Coalition. And look forward to just hearing more of what you're doing at Youth Pastor Theologian.
Yeah, agreed. And my affection for Reformed Youth Ministries runs deep. And I think I told you this just the other week when we saw each other. But when I came out to Nashville for the Youth Leader Training Conference that you guys host, I was in a pretty emotionally and spiritually raw state. And it was one of the hardest seasons of my own life personally. And RYM and you had a real gracious ministry for me personally. And so I really love your ministry and what you guys do, and joyfully send youth pastor theologians to go check out RYM and everything you guys offer.
Well, praise God for that. And look forward to many more conversations for sure.
Indeed.